Ladies and gentlemen, just hours ago, Vice President J.D. Vance sat down with a member of the liberal media over at ABC News, and he absolutely cooked all of the fake news lies that they've been pushing about President Trump still to this very day. And by the way, we also got a massive piece of news that we're going to talk about later on in today's video, so make sure you stick around for the entire show. But now, as you all know, really, the left-wing media's lies know absolutely no bounds. It doesn't matter what President Trump is doing or saying, the radical left-wing media is going to try to undermine him every single step of the way. However, like I said, Vice President J.D. Vance actually does a pretty good job of setting the record straight and putting all of these far-left radical progressives back in their place. And so on that note, let's just kick things off and get right into the show. So first, take a look at what Vice President J.D. Vance had to say about all of this Democrat gerrymandering. Let it play.
You have to ask yourself, why have Democrats gerrymandered their states aggressively over the past 10 to 20 years? If you look, for example, at the popular vote in a lot of these states, and Massachusetts, where 32% of the residents of Massachusetts voted for Republicans, 0 Republican federal representatives. So we're not trying to all we're doing, frankly, is trying to make the situation a little bit more fair on a national scale. The Democrats have gerrymandered their states really aggressively. We think there are opportunities to push back against that, and that's really all we're doing.
And so, folks, that's the case. Really, all that's happening here is that the Trump administration and all of the Republicans are undoing all of the gerrymandering that the Democrats have gotten away with for decades now. But okay, J.D. Vance wasn't actually quite done yet. Take a look.
We had way fewer House seats than we should have. One, if the Democrats hadn't aggressively gerrymandered, and two, if illegal aliens weren't counted in the census for purposes of apportioning congressional seats. The best estimates I've seen is that in California, for example, has 5 additional congressional seats than it should have because they count illegal aliens for the purpose of apportioning representatives. Meanwhile, Ohio, my home state, lost a representative. We're literally losing representatives for American citizens in order to give congressional representation to illegal aliens. Republicans are trying to balance out the scales a little bit for basic fairness and for the integrity of our democracy, which the president cares about as much as anybody in the country.
And really, that's what it's all about. It's about all of us American citizens actually being represented in our own country. But okay, take a look at why all of this is really such a big deal.
Of course, people who are here and who are not documented are not eligible to vote. But
they're not eligible to vote, but they do go in the congressional apportionment. That's why California has so many more seats, is because they count illegal aliens. So even though they don't vote, well, some of them actually do vote, but hopefully most of them don't, they end up getting congressional representation that ought by right go to American citizens.
I know.
And so, folks, that is the absolute truth. When you look at all of this gerrymandering stuff in that way, and that's really the proper way to look at it, the Democrats have been effectively stealing representation from actual American citizens for decades now. But you know what? Now let's go ahead and talk about all of the chaos and anarchy that the Democrats have brought to every single one of our cities across the entire country.
We don't have to live like this. My message to my fellow citizens here in D.C. or all across the country would be that allowing vagrants and armed robberies to take over your city, that's a policy choice. What President Trump is showing is that if you just empower local law enforcement to arrest and prosecute the bad guys, we can take back American streets. You, as a young family, whatever the color of your skin, you should not have to cross the street because there's a crazy person yelling at your children on the other side. You should not be worried that if you take your son out for a meal at 8 o'clock in the evening, an armed robber is going to assault your family. This is a policy choice to allow lawlessness to overrun our cities. The president has made a different policy choice. And I think what he's showing the entire American community is that we don't have to live like this. And that's the biggest thing that will come out of D.C. It matters a lot for D.C., but I think it matters more for the whole country to see that if we just make better choices, we can take back our cities.
And so, as you all know, President Trump is actually right this very moment on the cusp of deploying the National Guard to numerous cities across the country. So finally, we are about to solve a lot of these problems. But now, folks, this is where today's video gets a little bit spicy. You see, this is where this ABC talking head starts pushing Vice President J.D. Vance about how President Trump has been handling the ongoing Russia-Ukraine peace talks. But before we take a look at that, I do want to say real quick that if you guys enjoyed the daily news updates, please consider subscribing to the channel because it really does help a lot. But okay, take a look at this.
Where exactly is the pressure on Russia to do anything if you're not right now imposing new sanctions? How do you get them to a place of getting to the table with Zelensky and stopping to drop bombs?
But Kristen, I think that question betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of where we are. The president has applied aggressive economic leverage, for example, the secondary tariffs on India, to try to make it harder for the Russians to get rich from their oil economy. He's tried to make it clear that Russia can be reinvited into the world economy if they stop the killing, but they're going to continue to be isolated if they don't stop the killing. The president has applied more economic pressure to the Russians to stop this war than Biden did in 3 years.
You know,
so the idea that we're not doing anything, we're already doing things right now, and this is how negotiation works. You do something, you talk to the parties, you try to see if there's a meeting of minds. Again, we believe we've already seen some significant concessions from both sides just in the last few weeks. We're going to eventually be successful, or we'll hit a brick wall. And if we hit a brick wall, then we're going to continue this process of negotiation, of applying leverage. This is the energetic diplomacy that's going to bring this war to a close.
And now, folks, once again, something very important worth remembering here is that really none of this is President Trump's responsibility. President Trump has been working tirelessly night and day for over 6 months now to bring this war to a close. But once again, he's under no obligation to do so. Really, he's just doing all of this out of the goodness of his own heart. But also, take a listen to this.
I think the Russians have made significant concessions to President Trump for the first time in 3.5 years of this conflict. They've actually been willing to be flexible on some of their core demands. They've talked about what would be necessary to end the war. Of course, they haven't been completely there yet, or the war would be over, but we're engaging in this diplomatic process in good faith. We are trying to negotiate as much as we can with both the Russians and the Ukrainians to find a middle ground to stop the killing. I think what the president has tried to do here is try to engage in very aggressive, very energetic diplomacy, because this war is not in anyone's interest. It's not in Europe or the United States' interest. We don't think it's in Russia or Ukraine's interest to keep going. So we're going to keep on pushing for a diplomatic solution. And one final point about this, Kristen, if you look historically, whenever you have a complicated war with a lot of death and destruction, it kind of goes in fits and starts. There are hills and valleys to the negotiation. We sometimes feel like we've made great progress with the Russians, and sometimes, as the president has said, he's been very frustrated with the Russians. And we're going to keep on doing what we have to do to bring this thing to a close. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. I think that we're going to continue to make progress, but ultimately, whether the killing stops, that determination is going to belong to whether the Russians and the Ukrainians can actually find some middle ground here.
Well,
And you know what? That is the absolute truth. The reality is, President Trump can't force anyone to do anything, especially not a bunch of people over in Eastern Europe. That final determination is up to them. Really, President Trump can only help with the negotiating process. But you know what? What I'm about to show you next is really the single most important question of this entire interview. Take a look.
for Americans who are watching, can you guarantee no U.S. boots on the ground as a part of these security guarantees?
The president's very clear. There are not going to be boots on the ground in Ukraine, but we are going to continue to play an active role in trying to ensure that the Ukrainians have the security guarantees, the confidence they need to stop the war on their end. And the Russians feel like they can bring the war to a conclusion on their end. It's complicated, Kristen, but we're going to keep on trying to play these parties. We're going to keep on trying to convince these parties to talk to each other and continue to play the game of diplomacy, because that's the only way to get this thing wrapped up.
So folks, there is the confirmation. President Trump has just officially committed to no American boots on the ground in Ukraine. That is big. And so, ladies and gentlemen, here's the reality. Like we said earlier, it doesn't even matter what President Trump does or doesn't do. All of the far-left radical progressives are going to be pissed off and melt down either way. So with that being said, really, we should just keep on chugging along with our objective of finally putting America first.